All right, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much for that introduction, Steve. I will confess that this is probably the most people I've spoken in front of since I was a student teacher in 2019. COVID really lowers the amount of people you see. But I'm super excited to be here tonight to share this story with you. So like Steve said, I've interned with the OHS since 2020, and I've done a lot of really interesting things in that time. I was very lucky to get another internship with the OHS this past year, from about November until earlier this month. And this project was one of the things I worked on in those 4 months. And I'm really excited to share it with you today. All right, that's good name for that. All right. So during my internship these past few months, I researched the far-flung life of Captain Francis J. Brown, who was the original occupant of 289 Trafalgar Road, which is the house you see on the screen right now. This house, like most of the old houses in Oakville, has a history, and this one in particular is really interesting. It was first built and inhabited by Captain Brown, who was many things throughout his storied life, but a master mariner most of all. He was born in the mid-1800s, and he spent the latter half of that century sailing the Great Lakes. He went up the Niger River in Africa and spent about 20 years in the Sea of Japan. Interestingly enough, his career intersected a great deal of history, or perhaps historical moments, as we might call them. And what started as a history or the story of this one house and this one mariner swiftly became a much, much larger one. So what I hope to do here tonight is to share both the story of Captain Brown that we unearthed in the process of creating this video, and also kind of take a bit of a behind the scenes look at what goes into creating videos like these, from those of us in-house, but also from the OHS more broadly, the researchers, the wider community, as well as living descendants in this case. So for a quick agenda of what we'll do, you might be able to see that, of what we'll go through tonight, we're going to go through an overview of what the project was, a brief section on what I'm calling unearthing the story. So in that case, it's going to be the actual narrative of Captain Brown and his story, a little bit about the research process that went into that, and the broader historical movements that kind of informed his life. And then we'll talk a bit about the production of the video and wrap up with some reflections on the process. So the project, as was pitched to me, was to develop a 25 to 30-minute historical video on a selected subject of local interest. That subject was 289 Trafalgar Road and its first inhabitant, Captain Brown. When Mark Verlinden and I first sat down to talk about it, he told me Francis's story as he knew it then. This was mostly what was originally on the OHS's Plaqued Houses and Buildings website, which you should check out if you haven't yet had the opportunity. The entry for 289 Trafalgar is much longer now than it was 4 months ago, as you might imagine. Anyway, the original information drew from the sources we had access to at the onset, namely Oakville in the 16 and Old Oakville, 2 books that the OHS currently sells. Basically, Francis J. Brown was a British-born mariner who had the house currently located here built in the 1870s. He's also had some involvement in the building that would later become the Oakville Basket Factory, as well as a shop in town. In the late 1870s, he sailed a paddle steamer from England to Sierra Leone for the purpose of transporting missionaries and supplies up the Niger River. For that trip, he was gifted a Canadian ensign flag by the town of Oakville, which the OHS actually has in its collection. Later, he sailed for the Japanese government in a Japanese steamship company, which comprised most of his career. So needless to say, I was intrigued by this man and what he had done with his life. Captain Brown sailed during a very eventful time in world history, namely a period defined by renewed European imperial and colonial efforts. It's actually a little uncanny how many historical events he managed to get himself involved in. But what was so interesting about Francis at the onset was that his singular life was what his singular life and career could tell us about the broader sweep of history across the globe. Personally, I was most fascinated by what a Canadian man was doing in Japan in the Victorian era, or what was for them the Meiji Restoration. So the foundational sources that we started with were, as I've kind of already alluded to, 3 books. Oakville in the 16, Old Oakville, and A Rope in the Hand. The one on your right, A Rope in the Hand, is actually a biography of Francis that was written by Jesse L. Beatty in about the 1970s. And it's actually part of the OHS's library collection, which is why we had our hands on it. This biography is also, one of the reasons we felt confident enough to pursue the project, though we were concerned for a while in the early stages that there might not be enough information out there on Francis to create a video the length we wanted. I'll tell you now that that concern was put to rest very, very quickly, and you'll see why. So the first stage of this project was research. In retrospect, I use the word unearthing, and I'll use it quite a bit throughout this presentation because that was the general experience. More than once, I thought to myself, this is it. We figured it out. We have the whole story. And more than once, a new source or new information kind of wandered in and said, no, you don't. It was interesting that way. So while we knew a little bit about Francis's life from our Oakville sources, we were after the whole story or the wider story. And for that, we started from A Rope in the Hand, which as a biography helped me to lay out Francis's life in a timeline of sorts and then encapsulate it by locations in which he lived and worked. And they were as follows. And this is kind of the timeline I'll follow as I explain the narrative to you. So we start off in England and we're going to move to these locations here. And you can see kind of the timeline in years there. So we're going to start with his birth in 1841 and he passed away in 1909. So once I determined the basic timeline of these sections, as you can see, which we kind of called content capsules as we were writing them, I could begin to flesh out a narrative for each one. And as we move through them, I'm going to run through the narrative, but also and get into some of the research process that informed each one. After I painted a picture of Francis's life as we told it, I'll detail some of the fact-checking, debunking, and digging we had to do that kind of went into each one, as well as the invaluable contributions from other researchers from various parts of the world that helped to solve some of the biggest challenges of this project, which was simply conflicting narratives. So to begin, Francis J. Brown was born in 1841 in the village of Ringwood, which is located near the southern coast of England in Hampshire on the Avon River. He was the third of 10 children born to Richard Brown and Mary Ann Pritchard. The Brown family had traditionally held positions in the village's administration since the early 1700s, and Richard was indeed a law clerk in the village. His younger sons would have similar occupations, but his eldest two, Albert and Francis, our man of the hour, would buck tradition and pursue careers at sea for most of their lives. According to Beatty, Ringwood was home to many sailors and their families, Beatty being the author of the biography, among whom was a man named John Hyder, a merchant mariner who captained a boat of his own. Captain Hyder was known to tell stories of his time at sea to the village children. And it was actually through that captain and his stories that Francis met the captain's daughter, Hannah, whom he'd later marry and remain married to for the rest of his life. According to a Globe article from about 1896, which detailed an interview Francis had given with the newspaper, his first foray into the wider world came at some point between 1853 and 1856, when he was sent to live with an uncle in Quebec. He finished his education there at the Jesuit College in Point Levis. Apparently, he worked for the Grand Trunk Railway for a little bit as a teenager, but it wasn't super to his taste. So by 1857, he returned to England with the intent to make his living at sea. He then began 4 years as an apprentice. On the left, you'll actually see the testimonials and statement of his service, so all the ships he kind of sailed on as an apprentice. He sailed on about the three that are kind of put together there, and completed his apprenticeship in 1861. After completing his apprenticeship, he actually joined Captain Hyder, his future father-in-law, his crew aboard his ship, the Lady Milton, which is the last one on that list, for a couple months. And then in 1862, he qualified to sail in the British Merchant Service by attaining his second mate's certificate. For the next few years, he sailed a couple different voyages to the West Indies and to Bombay, India. In the biography, Beatty notes that Francis maintained a very faithful correspondence with Hannah all throughout those years, and his letters to her are quoted quite a bit in the biography. Around 1864, he returned to Canada West and joined a lake steamer on the Great Lakes as a senior crew member. He heard of an oil boom soon after that and decided to pursue that instead. This was in Bothwell, which is the photo on the right. which is now located within the municipality of Chatham-Kent, and was the third area to see a boom since the oil industry began in Ontario around 1850. Unbeknownst to me, before doing this project, there actually was an oil industry in Ontario. This boom lasted about 3 years, beginning 2 years prior to Francis' arrival in 1865. In fact, he barely got out before the bust. The bust was about in 1866. That same year, Hannah Hyder, her mother Jane, and her brother James all sailed over to Canada from England. Her father, the captain, had actually passed away at sea earlier that year. And Francis and Hannah were soon married. Francis was able to sell his well before the worst of the bust, and the newlyweds were able to spend the proceeds from the sale to settle in Oakville, where they would stay for the next 3 decades. So we have a census from 1871 that tells us that at that time, Francis was occupied as a merchant. His first job was as a grain buyer for a small little brewery on the west side of what's now Trafalgar Road, roughly at the end of McDonald Road. He himself took it over in 1870 and renamed it the Victoria Brewery. However, Oakville saw kind of the same kind of depression that most of Ontario saw in the 1870s, so he didn't really operate the brewery while he owned it. That being said, he looks like he pursued other mercantile ventures in the meantime. On the right, you'll see a notice for Brown and Hyder's store, which was placed in the Argus newspaper on September 20th, 1873. It's basically advertising the sale of coal and that you have to do it during September. The Hyder named here, we likely assumed was Hannah's brother, James, who is also listed on that census as being a resident of Oakville and living with the Browns. So also at this point, Francis sold the Victoria Brewery to William B. and Charles P. Chisholm, who would convert it into the Oakville Basket Factory. He returned to the Great Lakes at that point as a qualified mariner. And it was at this point that the house at 289 Trafalgar was built, which suited the needs of the family, now counting 4 children, who were Henry, Francis, Marion, and Emma. We'll come back to the particulars of this house a little later. So a generally agreed upon fact about Francis's life is that in the late 1870s, he captained a paddle steamer up the Niger River in Africa in the service of missionaries. As you might imagine, this portion of the narrative kind of necessitated some further research. Missionary work was quite common at this time, as it had been for centuries. The 1800s in particular saw the British Empire expand their influence across the globe, and the British viewed the work of Christian missionaries spreading their faith to colonized states to be an important arm of that expansion. The Browns were, in fact, Anglican, so they attended St. Jude's, which you'll see on the left there. So when a representative of the Church Missionary Society spoke at St. Jude's in 1876, Francis was there to hear them speak about missionary work in Africa. The Church Missionary Society, or the CMS as I'll call it, was established in the mid-1700s and was a product of the general rise of missionary activity and fervor at that time. They clustered their efforts in West Africa and were based in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which was then a British colony. This kind of interest coincided with the general trajectory of European colonialism in the 1800s. The CMS representative spoke specifically about the Niger mission, which was established along the Niger River in the 1850s. The CMS didn't have a ship suited to river travel, so they had issues visiting and resupplying the mission. Their intent was to commission such a vessel and mount an expedition up the river in 1878, and Francis volunteered to captain it. So in a letter from to his brother Albert, we get the sense that he was very excited to be at sea again. He was also fairly excited by the opportunity, which was an excitement that most of Oakville seemed to share. The town presented him with a red ensign flag, which is what you see on the right. The red ensign flag was kind of the unofficial flag of Canada until the maple leaf was adopted. And also a letter, which was signed by the mayor, prominent citizens, and other master mariners in town, which is what you see on the left. The OHS actually has both these objects in its collection. As a fun fact, and kind of a reason the letter is more important to the OHS beyond Francis, the letter is the only document known to bear the original town of Oakville seal. The original seal was destroyed in a fire, likely sometime in the early 1900s. It's incredibly faint on the letter. I've tried to give you a bit of a zoom in this bottom image here, but you can make out kind of the bare shape of it. We know from the original bylaw that established this seal that it was meant to be kind of a shield in shape, containing in quarters a ship to represent commerce, an engine to represent manufacturing, a sheaf of wheat for agriculture, and an oak tree for the town's stability and prosperity. So Francis set out from Oakville in 1877. The whole kind of trip was between 1877 and 1878 for Renfrew, Scotland, where he boarded the CMS's paddle steamer. This ship was called the Henry Venn and had been named for an influential secretary for the CMS. These two maps demonstrate their journey from there. You'll notice that they kind of pop into port quite a few times because the Henry Venn was a river boat. It wasn't particularly suited for open ocean travel, and they actually had a couple of false starts out of Falmouth when they didn't think they could make the channel, but eventually they did. And they kind of followed this route all the way down to Freetown in Sierra Leone. When they arrived there, they met the Bishop of West Africa, who is the man in the portrait on the left, whose name was Samuel Ajayi Crowther. He was the one who had arranged for this expedition, as well as gathered the funds for the Henry Venn, which is shown in the illustration on the upper right. Crowther was consecrated as bishop in 1864 and was the first African to hold such a high position in the Anglican Church. It was actually him who would open the Niger mission in the 1850s. Sorry. Crowther's appointment is part of a really interesting moment in the history of missionary work and colonialism in West Africa. Henry Venn, who was the namesake of Francis's ship, subscribed to a vision, shall we say, of mission work that believed that a new church should be self-propagating and self-governing. In the case of West Africa, this meant that African pastors would be mostly in charge of their own churches, their own kind of congregations. This wasn't a universally held idea. In fact, Crowther's diocese is actually very ambiguously defined, or it was very ambiguously defined rather, as the countries of Western Africa beyond the limits of British dominions. This carefully excluded British colonies of Lagos, Sierra Leone, and the Gold Coast, as kind of the prevailing racist attitudes of European missionaries at the time meant that they weren't going to install a Black bishop over white settlers. The interesting part of this chapter of Francis's life actually is the aftermath of the expedition. He'd interviewed before the Niger trip to captain another ship for the CMS on the east coast of Africa afterwards. And after this trip, he was even more invested because he'd come to respect the Bishop Crowther and the work of the diocese immensely during the trip up the Niger. It was a really good time for him, mostly the worries of he was sick for a while, but otherwise he had a good time. However, at the end of the 1870s, getting into the 1880s, those racist attitudes were kind of rearing their head again, and in a different direction. Higher ups in the CMS wanted to reassert white European authority in West Africa, and so they sought to diminish Bishop Crowther's authority and frowned upon his supporters. So when Francis was passed over for the next expedition, he was really surprised because he thought he'd done really well, and he thought that others shared this sentiment. In A Rope in the Hand, Beattie, the author, writes that it was because Francis supported Crowther and the work of African pastors in West Africa that he was denied another ship. So it's at this point that before I continue the story, I want to mention Alan Walker, who was a researcher from England that we collaborated with. Alan is the great-grandson of one of Francis's brothers, Walter Brown. So he was already doing a great deal of family research in and around Ringwood and England more broadly. This project also wouldn't be what it is without Alan's help and his contributions. The photographs you saw of Ringwood earlier all come from Alan and his work over there with their historical societies. But pertaining to where we are in Francis' story right now, because he was in England earlier this year, and still is, he was actually able to reach out to the Church Missionary Society and their archives, both for his work and ours. And he was able to request the report that Francis wrote for the CMS after his trip up the Niger, as well as any related documents that they might have in their archives. And one of the documents was this letter here, which is written by a man named Dandison Coates Crowther, who was the Archdeacon of the Niger and Bishop Crowther's son. So Francis wrote to him after he'd been essentially dismissed from the CMS, asking for what kind of sounds like a character reference. Archdeacon Crowther wrote back that he could certainly vindicate Francis's, quote, Christian and upright conduct, his gentlemanly bearing, and above all, the absence of that prejudice of color, which is the stumbling block of many of our European brethren out there. This letter was such a find. It was such a cool thing to have. Beatty had in fact referenced this very letter in her biography of Francis. And after reading it myself when we got our hands on it back in, I want to say January or February, I thought to myself, well, there's no way to know whether or not this is the actual reason. But the letter convinced me, at least, that there was a strong possibility that it was, in fact, Francis's lack of, quote, a prejudice of color, or in his case, maybe a little less racism than everyone else, that saw him dismissed from the CMS. So at that point, Albert kind of sailed back into a kind of morose Francis's life. Which brings me back to the first question I had when I approached this project back in November. What was someone like Francis doing in Japan? The answer to that starts with his brother Albert and the Meiji Restoration. So 20 years before Francis would arrive in Japan, the country was forcibly reopened to the world after 264 years of a policy called Sakoku, which was essentially national isolation and had been put in place by the Tokugawa shogunate, or their military government, in the 1600s. Francis was aware of this event. As a younger man, he'd even written to Hannah that, quote, "Even Japan is welcoming trade, and it is hard for me to realize that I was only 12 when Perry crashed her ports with his 3 black ships." Indeed, in 1853, the American Commodore Matthew Perry forced Japan to reopen its ports. In the aftermath, Japan was left with a number of unequal treaties with the United States and several European nations. The artwork on the left is Japanese, and it comes from the Met's collection, actually, and you can see the black ship in question on the left. The shogunate was removed from power in 1868, which sparked the Meiji Restoration, so named for the restoration of Emperor Meiji, in the photo on the right, to power. What followed was what I call a reassessment. The Meiji government sent officials across the Western world to determine what institutional structures they thought might be worth adopting in Japan, because a central edict of their new constitution was to kind of seek knowledge from the whole world to better strengthen imperial rule. These officials came back from their 2-year kind of whirlwind trip around Europe and North America with the idea that radical Westernization was necessary in order to both retain their sovereignty in this wider world, but also do away with the unofficial treaties, or not unofficial, the unequal treaties that they'd been saddled with. To that end, they hired about 3,000 Westerners from across Europe and North America to essentially infuse Japan with Western ideas and structures of law, of military education, science, medicine, commerce, and more. And this precisely is why Albert, who's on the left here, and later Francis were brought to Japan. So it was kind of a roundabout way I figured out why Francis was in Japan, and mostly through Albert in the first place. Albert was recruited from a British steamship company in 1869 in order to liaise with British shipyards and purchase steamships on the Meiji government's behalf, since at that point, the shipyards Japan had in places like Nagasaki weren't really up to the task of producing as many ships as they wanted. So they used people like Albert to kind of liaise with British shipyards to get those ships for them. Albert also was an advisor to their Bureau of Posts and Communications and drew up plans for a bureau to oversee shipping and shipbuilding in Japan. And he also played a role in setting up the Tokyo Mercantile Marine College. So given that so many other Western sailors were finding employment with Japan, in fact, I think the Brown brothers met their future brother-in-law while they were working for Japan. I think it was Captain Pine. He later married their sister Ada. He helped Francis get a job in Japan because it was good employment at the time. He helped them get a job with a company called Kyoto Unyu Kaisha, which was a transportation company at the time, and he sailed the ship you see in this black and white photo on the upper right, which is called the Takasago Maru. And his first job was to sail up and along the coast of Japan and to help set up or lay out locations for lighthouses and buoys. The lighthouse you see on screen right now is one of about, I want to say 60, maybe less, lighthouses from the Meiji era that are still standing in Japan today. After that, though, his work eventually turned to matters of commercial trade, especially when Kyoto Unyu Kaisha merged with its competitor Mitsubishi in 1885 to become the NYK line, which still operates today. So back in December, Mark and I had the opportunity to visit F.J. Brown & Son, which is a shop in Cambridge, Ontario. which was actually first established by Francis and his family in the early 1900s and is still a really successful shop today. I'll talk a bit more about the shop itself later, but for now, I'll say that Ted and Dave Brown were very kind to invite us for a visit to see some of the objects and artifacts that they had from Francis. Now, this was amazing for a number of reasons, obviously. Firstly, because their artifacts helped us to better sketch out Francis's career in Japan. I knew from my research that Francis had helped to transport medical supplies up and down the coast during a cholera outbreak in the 1880s. According to the biography, when I was doing my research, Francis was apparently given a letter of thanks from the Japanese government for his work, as well as 2 vases. And it's entirely possible that this was one of those vases. I also learned that, like Albert, the 2 of them had received the Order of the Sacred Treasure, the 6th class, toward the end of their careers. Francis got his in 1895. This was an award established by Emperor Meiji in 1888 for the recognition of long and or meritorious civil or military service. The Browns in Cambridge still had the medal, which is on the left, and the award on the right, and they were able to show them to us, which was really cool. Also during his time sailing for Japan, Francis kind of developed a tendency to send gifts home to Oakville that he had kind of acquired as he traveled to various ports in Asia on kind of trade matters. They were a collection of, it was a very broad collection. It could span from ivory, china, bronzes, wood carvings, bolts of silk, embroideries, tapestries, paintings, handmade jewelry, and vases. And we were able to see some of those objects during our visit, the ones they still had, which are some of the things you see on screen right now. Apparently, he sent home a lot of gifts, like a lot, to the point that by 1889, Hannah, his wife, had to put her foot down and say that, no, the house is too full. You can't send any more. And that maybe they didn't need them all for themselves, because I guess at one point you can have too many vases. What they did, though, with all these artworks was they decided to open their house to the people of Oakville as an exhibition and sold whatever people wanted to buy. They must have sold a very significant amount because Hannah and the children continued to sell pieces from the collection until they ended up moving from Oakville a little later. And in 1895, when Francis received that award, it was the same year he retired and eventually returned to Canada. So this brings us back to the shop, F.J. Brown and Son. By 1895, when Francis was retiring, oh my gosh, one second. Sorry about that. So when he was retiring, by this point, most of the children had begun to grow up and kind of pursue their own careers. His second eldest, Frank, had apprenticed to a watchmaker and had become expert enough to open his own shop in Galt, which is what you see in these 2 pictures on screen. And it's now part of in Galt, which is now part of Cambridge in Ontario. In 1896, Francis and Hannah sold their home in Oakville, and much of the family followed Frank to Galt. There, they decided to expand the small venture of selling the objects Francis brought back from Asia in partnership with Frank's existing business. They opened this shop to call it the Oriental Bazaar, the name being, of course, very much a product of its time, but also just kind of reflective of what they sold there. If you look at the picture on the rightmost side, you can see the little F.J. Brown and Son, but if you look at the window on the other side, beside the man in the suit, you can see a little bit of the word Oriental. So that's the name of the shop. So the inventory rotated over time because it was kind of subject to whatever Francis could either ship back while he was still working, or after he retired, he maintained contact with agents overseas to keep sending things on his behalf. They were very particular to have information and kind of descriptions of what it was they were selling, because a point of interest for some of the people buying was they wanted to know what it was. So Hannah and the children who worked in the shop, mostly the 2 girls, I believe Emma and Bertha, who we believe were the women in these pictures, they were very happy to always share that information with their customers. So over the years, the shop expanded and sold jewelry as well. So eventually the name Oriental Bazaar was dropped and the shop became simply known as F.J. Brown and Son, and it's still a jewelry shop today. All right, so that's the story as we kind of put it all together after all the fact checking, digging, and debunking. But like I said, the biggest challenge with this project was conflicting narratives. So I'll go over two of the kind of historical tangles that we kind of had to detangle in a way to puzzle out this story. So for the first one, we're going to talk about Hannah. So Francis's wife, Hannah, her origins were the first source of conflicting information, or as, like I said, a historical tangle. Both of our major Oakville sources, Oakville in the 16 as well as Old Oakville, seem to posit that Hannah was a member of the Griggs family in Oakville, specifically the granddaughter of a man named Barnet Griggs. This was directly contradicted by A Rope in the Hand, which firmly placed Hannah in Ringwood, England, as the daughter of John and Jane Hyder. We were a little dubious about the Griggs family connection when we first started out, so we did some digging to find out where this idea came from. What we did was we actually looked into the property records of 289 Trafalgar, and we found the source of the confusion. Namely, the idea that, quote, Brown inherited the property from the resolution of the long contested will of his wife's grandfather, and that the property went to the Browns through Jane Moore Hyder, Francis's sister-in-law. Both of these assertions are incorrect. But let's debunk that first one first. The will of the man who was thought to be Hannah's grandfather, Barnet Griggs, his will actually was contested quite a bit. What you see on screen is, I believe, a copy of the some registry details for the property. So upon Griggs's death, it would seem that he left the land that would become the 289 Trafalgar House, which is known as Park Lot J. He left all that to his wife, and this was contested by other members of the family, it would seem. It's a little difficult to follow the legal back and forth, but what's important to note is that in 1870, Jane Moore Hyder, widow, was assigned a mortgage on the property. And from there, the property kind of jostled around between Jane and the Browns. Now, looking at these registry details here, it's actually fairly easy to see where the misconception arose. So I've kind of pointed out the underlined Moore. I'm guessing someone made a connection between the names, between some common names on this screen here, and connected Hannah and Jane to a man further up on the list, John Moore, saw those two Moores and thought, okay, same family. And James Moore was in fact married to Barnet Griggs's daughter, Sally. So that's kind of the overlap there. In clearing this up, we were enormously lucky to have the help of Janet Godber, who is a wizard in all things census related. She was able to find the census records that would place Hannah overseas in England. These are from baptism records, and they put her right at June 11th, 1846, specifically in Dorset, but England regardless. This was later corroborated by some of the stuff Alan was able to get to us from England. I think the same baptismal records as well as some parish records, which lists Jane and Hannah as residents of Ringwood, not Oakville originally. And as for the second assertion, technically the property did go between Jane and Francis, but Jane is Hannah's mother, not her sister. So this was both a really fun kind of moment of historical sleuthing and trying to figure out kind of where between the archives and a book certain ideas crop up. But it's also an interesting case of what can happen when you're working with archival material. It's perfectly natural for someone looking at these records to make assumptions, and a matching name is actually a really easy one to make, especially if you don't have any other point of reference. So the second one was actually Francis's early life and sailing career. As with Hannah, one source said one thing and another said another. I think this section actually saw the most rewrites in the script for the final video, just because I think we had at least 3 different things like enter the conversation as like, this is what his early life was like, or no, this was what his early life was like. So yeah. A Rope in the Hand rather broadly painted Francis's early life and career. It featured what's actually a really funny little story about the 2 brothers, Albert and Francis, leaving school one day and running off to the sea, basically going from Ringwood over to Southampton. I think they said they even got onto a ship and were almost ready to leave before someone noticed that they had no parental permission and just sent them back ashore. It's a fun story, and we actually had it in the script for a while, but in the end we removed it, opting for the narrative that I told earlier in this presentation. This came from a collection of sources sent to us by Alan Walker, including all the documents we have about Francis's apprenticeship and certifications and the Globe article that I mentioned earlier. Now, we had two very different narratives for Francis's childhood. One that was in England with this, running away to Southampton, and another with a few years spent with an uncle in Quebec. As you can see, we went with the latter narrative, mostly because the Southampton story didn't really have anything else to corroborate it. For us, this was an instance of having to kind of weigh your sources against each other and decide which essentially you trust more. And that can be hard when you don't have, like, in some cases, a lot of history to work with. But the Globe article was what sold us, because between kind of the dates and anecdotes that we had, they matched the dates and anecdotes in the Globe article, rather, they matched the dates on the one of the documents you see here on the right of his apprenticeship. They matched all that. And given that the Globe article was published in 1896, it was much more of a primary source than Beattie's biography of him. So that's why we went with that one. All right, so after all that was ironed out, that takes us into production. And this was kind of the last stage of the project. Our intent was to produce a video that moved through a series of images with a voiceover telling the story. So once the research was done and the script was written, I moved on to storyboarding out the video. Essentially, I collected photographs and images of artifacts that suited the content, or better explain the story as the voiceover told it. I was able to draw quite a bit from the OHS's collection, but the photos from F.J. Brown and Son, the shop, as well as Alan, really rounded out the Ringwood and Galt narratives. Some of those are on screen right now. Essentially, just photographs and images of artifacts that suit. Where am I? Actually, okay, fun story about the one on the left of Hannah. Up until really late in the process, we didn't have a single picture of Hannah, absolutely none. And since she's a fairly large presence in the story, that was kind of sad. We had pictures of Francis, we had pictures of the children even, because they were in those pictures about the shop in Galt. But almost at like the last second, I want to say the 11th hour, like the script was done, everything was done. Dave Brown, who was one of the descendants we'd met on our visit to Cambridge in December, he found this picture of her and was able to email us, and we were able to get it into the video. And I think that's the photograph I was the most excited about. I think of any find we had, it was this one picture of Hannah that really excited me, because I was happy to get her face in there. So another part of the production was recording the voiceover itself. I provide the majority of the narration, but because we had so many direct quotes from Francis, thanks to A Rope in the Hand, as well as the CMS documents that were passed along to us, we kind of toyed with the idea of having a distinct and different voice for him. And we did. We found a man named John Oldham who had like a great an accent that suited Francis. And he very kindly voiced Francis throughout the finished video. All right, so once we had gotten those voiceovers recorded and they were kind of all put together, I passed everything along to Steve, who put them all together into the video in their final form. Yeah. So to finish off, I just want to share some reflections on the project and the process. So this was actually a challenging project at times, but it was actually immensely rewarding as well. This was the first time I'd worked on a video. And so the process was quite different from the other kinds of work I've done in the past. I think we moved through 11 drafts of the script from start to finish, which was a lot. And I was so as I was actually preparing for this presentation, I went back and looked at some of the earlier scripts that we'd had back in the fall. And it's staggering how different they are after kind of all the development and editing and all the kind of eyes that looked at them and all the input we had. That being said, working to create in a different sort of medium, because I'm really more versed with exhibition text and kind of interpretive tours, this was a great experience that I know I'll be able to take into my career, which is great. Second point, this project very much, quote, took a village. As the saying goes, collaborating with other researchers and speaking with living descendants was as well a great experience and really different from anything I'd done in the past. Their contributions allowed us to craft that wider, more fuller narrative that we were hoping to, which was great. I didn't mention it in the presentation before, but Albert Brown, at the end of his career, actually founded a company in Scotland. He took that shipbuilding, and it's now a steel company that's still running, and his descendants are still working there. I actually emailed them about the photo of him that you would have seen in this presentation, asking them for their permission to use it. And they were very interested in the whole project, and we're happy to grant permission. So that was fun as well. And the last point being research. This was a very research-heavy project, as you could have probably gathered by this point. But it was really, really fun, possibly the most fun part of it, though it was very rigorous. I felt a little bit like a historical detective at times, trying to like ferret out the inconsistencies or figure out what was true and what wasn't. Especially like Hannah's origins, like looking through all the documents, getting census details, and all that. Also, I found myself digging into possibly the strangest topics I never thought I'd be researching for this. For example, I now know more than I ever thought I would ever know about the history of Japanese commercial shipping than I ever thought I would need to know in my life, simply because I was trying to figure out what Albert and Francis were doing there. But it's my understanding of history, which was great. So yeah. So thank you all for coming tonight and listening to my presentation. I hope maybe next time you take a walk down Trafalgar and you see 289, you remember a little thing or two about the captain and about the story. And also I hope that you do check out the full video when it's published on YouTube and a couple other places. And yeah, thanks so much.
Looking for more great content like this? Why not check out the Oakville Historical Society website, YouTube channel, or Facebook and Instagram pages.